All right, this is the first of our review videos for the first exam for Introduction to Philosophy. This video is going to cover the cosmological argument, specifically the first cause cosmological argument. As we discussed in class, cosmological arguments, as a family of arguments, begin with a premise that identifies some feature of the universe or cosmos and then ends with the conclusion that the universe has a creator, which is identified with God. And we discussed in class two versions of the cosmological argument, or two cosmological arguments. The first one is the first cause argument due to Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. And then we discussed a later version of the argument from the modern period, which we call the contingency cosmological argument, due largely to the philosopher Leibniz, but Samuel Clarke also contributed to developing that argument. So this video, we're going to focus on the first cause argument. And the first cause argument is also known as the argument from efficient causation. And an efficient cause, according to Aquinas, is that which brings a being into existence or that which causes it to exist. Your parents, for example, are jointly your efficient cause. This is the passage in question. The second way is Aquinas' name for this argument. It's the second of 5 ways to prove the existence of God, according to Aquinas. He says that the second way is from the nature of efficient cause. In class, we read through this passage a number of times, so I'm not going to, in this video, read the whole thing. Instead, I'm just going to quickly move through pulling out the premises as we did in class so that we can quickly reconstruct it to remind you of the basic structure of the argument. The conclusion of the argument is this: therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name God. So if we're trying to reconstruct Aquinas' argument, here we have his conclusion. Therefore, there is a first cause. And by a first cause, Aquinas means a being that meets these two conditions. One is the efficient cause of everything else. So that is the kind of creator requirement. And 2, itself has no efficient cause. So that is the requirement that this being, whatever it is, if he can establish there is one, is lacking in any being prior to it that brings it into existence. So this is a being that creates everything else, but that itself is uncreated. The first premise of the argument is this: in the world of sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. And the way we're going to put this, the way we put it in class, is this: there's a series of efficient causes. And by series, we just mean any 2 or more beings that stand in the efficient causation relation. So for example, you and your parents qualify as the 2 links in the chain that is the series of efficient causes because they cause you. And that's really all Aquinas means by this first premise. There are efficient causes. Some things bring other things into existence. And so here, this is what's showing you that this is a cosmological argument for the existence of God, because Aquinas is beginning with an observation about the universe. He says, look, we look into the universe, we look around us, and what we see is that some things bring other things into existence. There is a series of efficient causes out there. And he wants to argue from that observation to the conclusion that there has to be a first uncaused cause, which he thinks is God. This, of course, is not a valid argument. If all we had were this one premise that says there is a series of efficient causes and the conclusion, therefore, there's a first, this would not be logically valid. And the way to see this is to, as we discussed, ask yourself, is it possible for the premises, in this case premise, to be true and yet for the conclusion to be false. In class, what we did was we diagrammed a possible situation in which, yes, there's a series of efficient causes, but no, there's no first cause. One way to do that is to have a circle of efficient causes, such that the first being causes the second, which causes the third, which causes the fourth, which causes the fifth, which causes the sixth, which in turn causes the first. In that case, there is no being in the series that lacks an efficient cause. And for that reason, there's no being in the series that is the first by the definition we gave earlier. Nevertheless, there is a series of efficient causes here. So what we've come up with is an example or a possible situation on which the premise is true but the conclusion's false. So if our goal here is to extract from the text an argument that is logically valid, that is one such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion is also true, we would know right away that we couldn't stop here. If we're trying to figure out what are Aquinas' premises with the assumption that he has a valid argument in mind, we know for sure he has more in mind than just a single premise. And of course, there's a lot more text. So when we turn back to the text, we see a second premise right after the first one. He says this: there's no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. Effectively, the way we're going to understand that claim is this: he's providing us with another premise that tells us explicitly the series of efficient causes that there is not circular. It doesn't loop back on itself. And we'll come back to why he thinks that later. For now, we just want to represent what his premises are so that we can arrive at a reconstruction of the argument where the premises logically entail the conclusion. And then we'll ask, why does he think that those premises are true? So, once again, if these were our only two premises, this would not be a valid argument either. No surprise, given that there's more text that we haven't mentioned yet. The way to see that this isn't a valid argument yet is to consider the possibility of an infinite series of efficient causes, specifically a series of efficient causes that stretches backwards into the past infinitely. And the way we can define such a series is as follows. A series is infinite. A series of efficient causes is infinitely long in the past, just in case. It's a linear series, so it's one that isn't circular, of efficient causes in which every being is caused by some prior being in the series. So if it's really linear, so it never loops back, and every being in the series is caused by some prior being, then what you will definitely have will be an infinitely long series, specifically one that stretches backwards into the past infinitely. So for any being, there's some prior being that brought it into existence. Maybe it's infinitely long in the future. For our purposes, we care about the backward-looking direction. Now, if there were such a series, we would have true premises and a false conclusion. It would be true that there is a series of efficient causes. Here it is. At least one being causes another. It's also true that there's not a circle of efficient causes here, and nevertheless, it is not the case that there is a first cause. Why not? Well, because there's no being in this series that is both uncaused and is the cause of everything else. Indeed, every being in this series fails to meet both of those two conditions. So when we turn back to the text, what we find is Aquinas, sure enough, has explicitly said to us, hey, I also think that the series of efficient causes can't be infinitely long in the past. It can't be the case that for any being in the series, it has a prior being that is its efficient cause. So our completed reconstruction of the argument, which is going to be valid, includes a premise that explicitly says the series of efficient causes is not infinitely long in the sense that we just defined it. This is our complete reconstruction of the argument. Here it is. We'll call it the first cause argument. We've just changed the names of the premises and conclusions to indicate that they're all steps of one single argument. FC1, there's a series of efficient causes. FC2, the series of efficient causes is not circular. FC3, the series of efficient causes is not infinitely long. FC4, therefore, there is a first cause. This is a valid argument. That is, if 1, 2, and 3 are all true, then 4 has to be true. If it's true that there's a series of efficient causes, and it's true that it doesn't loop back on itself, and it's true that it's finite, then it follows that there's going to be some first member of the series that is the efficient cause of every subsequent member in the linear series, and that itself, because it's finite, has no first cause. So if those premises are true, has no efficient cause. If those premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Our question now, whenever we encounter an argument, we want to know, is it valid and is it sound? We've got, yes, this is valid. But validity is not that difficult to achieve if you know a bit of logic, and of course Aquinas did. So the mere fact that this is a valid argument doesn't purchase us very much. What we want to know now as philosophers is, why should I believe these premises? Because in order to have a sound argument, you need to have an argument that is both valid and has true premises. Well, when we look at the premises, the first premise really no one should dispute. All Aquinas needs here is for you to agree that sometimes some beings bring other beings into existence. If you can agree with him that sometimes some builders make a house that didn't exist before the builders did their work, then you agree with him that premise 1 is true. So really no one should be fighting with him about premise 1. Premise 2 is a little more interesting, but we're going to mostly spot in premise 2 because he has an interesting and I think quite plausible defense of the claim that the series of efficient causes isn't circular. When we look back to the text, he says this: why can't it be that a series of efficient causes is circular? Well, he says, there's no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself, for so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. As we discussed in class, his thought here is, if the series of efficient causes were circular, then it would follow that there's some being that is directly or indirectly, via the other links in the chain, its own efficient cause. Now, efficient causes are prior to their effects. One read of what he means by that is that they precede their effects in time. So if there were a circle of efficient causes, then some being would precede its own existence in time. In other words, if there were a circle, then there would be some time at which some being both exists and does not. But that's a contradiction. And so it means that there cannot therefore be a circle of efficient causes, because if there were, a contradiction would obtain. We know there are no contradictions, no true contradictions, and so there can't be a circle. That's a pretty interesting and I think plausible defense of his second premise, so we'll give that to him. The more interesting and I think controversial step is the claim that the series of efficient causes is not circular. Why does Aquinas think this? Well, when we return to the text, what we see is he does give a defense of this claim, and it's quite lengthy. I'm not going to read the passage again. Instead, I'm just going to give you my best understanding of what's going on in the passage. Unfortunately, as we discussed in class, I don't think that this is a good defense of premise 3. Or we'll put it this way, I don't think this is a defense that is likely to convince anyone who didn't already buy the conclusion. So we'll talk about that in a second. I think that this is his defense in that passage there, in the middle bit of the second way. He says something like this: here's why the series of efficient causes can't be infinitely long. If the series were infinitely long, then there would be no first cause. That much is just true by definition. But second, if there were no first cause, then nothing else in the series could exist, because everything depends on a first cause. And so it follows from that if the series were infinitely long, then nothing else would exist. There would be no builders building houses. There would be no parents bringing children into existence if there were no first. And so if the series were infinitely long, then none of those things would exist either. But of course, we look around and we see there is a series of efficient causes. Some things do bring other things into existence. There are parents and children, there are builders and houses, and so on. So it follows from 3.3 and 3.4 that therefore the series is not infinitely long. Because Aquinas has argued that if the series is infinitely long, then nothing else would exist. But some things do exist, therefore the series is not infinitely long. Now this is a valid defense of FC3, but my worry is, and other commentators on this passage have had similar worries, if this is the right interpretation, which I'll bracket the possibility that there's another interpretation of the passage here that doesn't have this problem, but if this is the right interpretation, it seems that this defense, although valid, has another flaw, which is that if you look at that second step, Aquinas says, if there is no first cause, then nothing else exists. Effectively, his claim here is that every being depends for its existence on a first cause. But if we zoom back out for a second and remind ourselves of the context, Aquinas is trying to give us an argument for the conclusion that there is a first cause. Now, if you imagine him in dialogue with somebody who doesn't believe that there's a first cause, then that person would not grant him the premise that he's using here that says every being depends on a first cause. They would say, wait a second, you were supposed to convince me of that. If I already believed that there's a first cause, you wouldn't need your argument. So effectively what Aquinas seems to be doing in defense of the claim that the series of efficient causes isn't infinitely long is assuming that every being has to depend on a first. But the worry is that is the conclusion of the argument that he's supposed to be convincing us of. The way we put this, and the way philosophers sometimes put this, is it seems that this argument, because of this failure in the defense of the third premise, is question begging. It seems to be one whose premises inappropriately assume its conclusion. Sometimes, as we discussed in class, question begging is really explicit. It's a literal repetition of the conclusion as one of the premises. Sometimes it's a little more indirect or a little more implicit, and I think this case falls maybe somewhere in between. You have to sort of dig into his defense of the third premise to find that he does seem to be relying on the claim that there is a first cause sort of deep into the argument he's giving in defense of premise 3. As a result, though, the reasoning does indirectly rely on the conclusion. And so no one who didn't already buy the conclusion would be convinced by this argument. In that way, this argument may be sound, but it's in this sense useless, because it's not going to be useful for converting people to the conclusion that there's a first cause unless those people already believed that there's a first cause, which is not really conversion, or not really a way of convincing somebody of what they didn't already believe. So the upshot, and this is where we left off in class with this argument, is that this is an interesting argument. I'm not sure whether it is successful, because I think that third premise has not been adequately supported in a way that doesn't beg the question. And we ended by saying that we'll use the infinite series objection as a shorthand for the following worry about cosmological arguments. The worry that plagues many versions, especially early versions of the argument, is that these arguments, many of them, rely on an undefended assumption, namely that the series of efficient causes can't be infinitely long. And when the skeptic asks the theist to defend that claim, they either come up empty with no defense, or they provide a defense that is in some way circular or question begging. And so unless and until defenders of cosmological arguments can either devise a version of the argument that doesn't rely on that assumption, or can give a good defense of the assumption, it seems that cosmological arguments are not going to be convincing the skeptic of what the theist wants to convince them of. So next time we'll pick up there with the cosmological argument from contingency, which tries precisely to sidestep the infinite series objection by not relying on the assumption that the series can't be infinitely long.